Have you ever felt the crushing weight of doing everything exactly right, only to watch your world fall apart anyway? Imagine a man who sacrificed his body, his time, and his very presence in his home, all for the sacred duty of providing for his family. For 10 years, he gave his sweat to build towering monuments of glass and steel, sincerely believing his grueling labor was the only thing keeping his loved ones safe. But what happens when the modern world decides your calloused hands are no longer needed? What happens when a cold, faceless algorithm erases your identity in a single morning, leaving you standing in the freezing rain outside a locked church, demanding answers from God? Sometimes, what feels like absolute divine abandonment is actually a profound rescue mission. We often measure our worth by our exhaustion, forgetting that the creator of the universe worked at a human pace. How does a devastating loss of dignity become the exact path to reclaiming a soul? How does a desperate, silent act of charity in a rainy alleyway lead a broken father back to his rightful place at the dinner table? The heavy, steel-toed boots were caked in a thick, gray mud that felt more like wet cement dragging down the spirit than mere dirt on the ground. Thomas sat alone in the dimly lit cab of his idling pickup truck, listening to the deafening, chaotic roar of the morning, rain lashing against the cracked windshield. His hands, rough as coarse sandpaper and permanently stained with the indelible grease of 1,000 12-hour shifts, wrapped tightly around a battered metal thermos. He took a long, slow drink of the black coffee, but he didn't even taste the bitterness anymore. It was just dark fuel for a broken, exhausted machine. Right here. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Thomas swallowed the scalding liquid and closed his eyes, leaning his aching head against the freezing glass of the driver's side window. The world outside his truck was a chaotic, imposing symphony of modern industry and relentless ambition. Massive tower cranes swung like giant, skeletal pendulums against the stormy pendulums. Bruised sky, heavy pallets of steel beams clanged against one another in the deluge, and the harsh, unnatural glare of temporary halogen lights pierced through the gray downpour, casting long, menacing shadows. This was the construction site of a massive corporate plaza, a towering monument to glass, stale, and a culture that never slept. And Thomas was just one of the countless, unseen, and unspoken hands building it. He was a man who believed, with every fiber of his weary being, in the sacred duty of the provider. For nearly a decade, his daily rhythm had been defined by chronic exhaustion. He left his house hours before the sun dared to rise, carefully creeping past the bedroom door of his 9-year-old daughter, Sarah, holding his breath so as not to wake her. He would return long after the streetlights had flickered to life, his body aching so profoundly that sometimes he could not even muster the energy to speak at the dinner table. He traded his physical presence, his health, and his precious waking hours for the overtime pay that kept his family afloat in an increasingly unforgiving, rapidly inflating economy. He believed that this was what love looked like, a silent, brutal martyrdom of the body to ensure they had a roof over their heads. But this morning, as the torrential storm raged outside, there was an unfamiliar basking, gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach. A subtle, cold vibration in the damp air that had nothing to do with the freezing rain or the biting wind. The sight was moving too fast. The rhythm of the labor was frantic, stripped entirely of all human pacing or compassion. The modern corporate hustle culture surrounding him did not treat men as fathers, husbands, or souls possessing inherent, God-given dignity. It treated them as expendable variables on a digital spreadsheet. He finally stepped out of the truck, the freezing rain immediately slicing through his high-visibility jacket, chilling him to the bone. As he walked toward the skeletal frame of the unfinished building, his boots sinking into the muck, he noticed the project foreman standing near the temporary office trailers. The foreman was a young man, barely out of a prestigious business school, holding a pristine iPad shielded by a large golf umbrella. He wasn't looking at the magnificent structure being built. He wasn't looking at the threatening sky. And, most chillingly, as Thomas approached, the foreman stubbornly refused to look him in the eye. There is a profound, unbridgeable spiritual difference between honest labor and a system that consumes human life. While Christian tradition has long venerated the dignity of work, the modern world has twisted that beautiful virtue into a relentless, unforgiving idol. We are constantly taught that a man's worth is directly proportional to his economic output. Thomas had internalized this devastating lie completely. He believed his family's love and God's favor were entirely conditional upon his ability to endure this soul-crushing grind. But as his calloused hands reached out to grab a heavy coil of reinforced cable, the foreman's voice cut through the rhythmic sound of the rain. Thin, corporate, and entirely devoid of human emotion. Thomas, leave the cable. Come into the trailer. The words were quiet, but they carried the devastating, earth-shattering weight of a falling anvil. Thomas froze in the mud, his hands hovering over the wire, realizing with a sudden, suffocating panic that the fragile world he had sacrificed everything to build was about to be violently torn apart. The inside of the temporary office trailer smelled faintly of stale ozone, cheap synthetic carpet, and damp, recycled paper. The fluorescent tube lights overhead buzzed with an irritating, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate directly into Thomas's teeth, exacerbating the pounding headache forming behind his eyes. He stood just inside the doorway, his muddy boots dripping thick puddles onto the pristine linoleum floor, suddenly hyper-aware of how much space he took up, how filthy his hands were, and how deeply he did not belong in this sterile, calculating environment. The foreman, still actively refusing to make eye contact, swiped a manicured finger across his iPad, pulling up a digital file that represented a decade of a man's life reduced to mere data. He didn't offer Thomas a chair. He didn't offer a cup of coffee or a word of gratitude. The entire interaction was clearly designed by corporate human resources to be as brief, clinical, and frictionless as possible, at least for the company. We're restructuring the site budget for the third quarter, the young man said. His voice rehearsed, flat, and chillingly polite. Corporate is moving to a more automated logistical system to increase profit margins. We're downsizing the manual oversight crews across the board. Today is your last day. Thomas felt all the air violently leave his lungs. It wasn't a firing based on incompetence, laziness, or a failure of character. It was an erasure based entirely on an algorithm. A computer program halfway across the country had calculated that his 10 years of unwavering loyalty, his ruined back, and the heavy calluses that made it difficult to fully open his hands in the morning were mathematically redundant. I've got a daughter, Thomas managed to say, his voice thick, gravelly, and trembling with a sudden, desperate vulnerability. I've worked 4 weekends in a row. You need me on the structural framing. The new guys don't know how to read the load-bearing joints. I know this building better than the architects do. The foreman finally looked up, but his eyes were empty. Shielded by the invisible armor of corporate policy, he pushed a generic, stark white envelope across the cheap folding table. Inside was a minor severance check and a thick, legally binding non-disclosure agreement. "It's not my call, Thomas. The decision was made above me. Please leave your hard hat and your site ID badge on the desk. Security will walk you to your truck." This was the first visible layer of his exclusion, and it was agonizing in its specific, quiet cruelty. Taking off his battered yellow hard hat, a piece of equipment covered in the scratches, dents, and scuffs of 1,000 honest days of labor, felt like peeling off a piece of his own living flesh. He set it gently on the table next to the crisp, white envelope. The visual contrast was sickening. The hard hat possessed a deep, authentic history. The envelope possessed only a cold, abrupt ending. As the junior security guard, a kid who looked like he belonged in a college library rather than on a construction site, escorted him through the mud back to the parking lot. The injustice of the system flared like a physical fire in Thomas's chest. The modern world tells a devastatingly false narrative. If you just work hard enough, if you just sacrifice enough of your own blood, sweat, and time, you will be safe. You will be valued. Thomas believed this false explanation implicitly. He had built his entire theology of self-worth around it. He believed that his grueling suffering was the very shield protecting his family from ruin. Walking to his truck in the freezing rain, entirely stripped of his badge, his title, and his authority, he felt a profound and terrifying loss of dignity. He wasn't just losing a steady income. In his mind, he was losing his fundamental justification for existing. If he was not a provider, what was he? If his hands were no longer needed to build, why did God give him such heavy, capable hands in the first place? The rain washed the mud from his boots as he drove away from the site, but it could not wash away the deep, burning humiliation of being discarded by a world he had literally helped build. The long drive home was a disorienting blur of gray highways and the rhythmic, taunting squeak of windshield wipers. By the time Thomas pulled his truck into his own driveway, it was late afternoon. The storm had settled into a steady, miserable drizzle. He sat in the cab for a long agonizing time, watching the warm, yellow light spilling from his own living room window. Inside that house was everything he loved, everything he had sworn to protect. And suddenly, he felt utterly unqualified to enter it. He felt like a trespasser in his own life. When he finally gathered the courage to walk through the front door, the rich, comforting smell of dinner, roasted chicken, rosemary, and garlic hit him like a physical blow. His wife, Maria, smiled warmly from the kitchen, wiping her flour-dusted hands on an apron. Sarah, his 9-year-old daughter, was sprawled on the living room rug on her stomach, surrounded by colored pencils, glue, and construction paper. It was a perfect picture of domestic peace and safety, a peace that had been funded entirely by a paycheck that no longer existed. Thomas gave a weak nod, walked straight down the hall to the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the faucet to a roar to drown out any sound. He leaned over the sink and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked 10 years older than his actual age. The deep lines around his eyes were carved by chronic exhaustion and perpetual worry. The sacred wound of his life was not merely the sudden loss of the job. It was the terrifying, undeniable realization that he had become a complete stranger in his own home. He had traded his physical and emotional presence for financial provision. And now, he had absolutely neither. He felt entirely stripped of value. Later, at the dinner table, The silence was suffocating. Thomas chewed his food mechanically, terrified that if he opened his mouth, the devastating truth would spill out and shatter the fragile peace of the room. He was enduring an intimate spiritual loneliness that millions of men and women suffer in absolute silence. The paralyzing fear of admitting weakness to the very people who depend on them. He mistakenly believed that his family's love was strictly tethered to his economic utility. He forgot that to those who truly love us, we are valuable simply because we exist, not because of what we produce. Dad Sarah's soft, hesitant voice broke his dark trance. She was holding up a piece of drawing paper. I have to build a diorama for my history project tomorrow. It's about the Roman aqueducts. Can you help me cut the thick cardboard? You're the best builder I know. Thomas looked closely at the drawing she had used as a blueprint. It was a crude, colorful sketch of their family. Maria was drawn in bright, vivid detail, smiling with her hands outstretched. Sarah was drawn holding a small dog they didn't even own. But next to them, standing slightly apart near the edge of the paper, was a dark, hurried scribble. A blurry, gray, faceless shadow wearing a yellow hard hat. That was exactly how his daughter saw him. Not as a face, not as a warm smile, not as a guiding presence, but as a fleeting, exhausted shadow that only occasionally passed through the hallway. An invisible knife twisted violently in his chest. His total physical and emotional absence was the true tragedy of his life. A slow, silent erasure of his fatherhood. And now, the micro-humiliation of his new reality demanded a cruel answer. He could tell her the truth. He could say, I have nowhere to go tomorrow. I was fired. I have all the time in the world. But his pride, bruised, bleeding, and terrified of losing her respect, refused to let him fall from the pedestal of the busy provider. I can't, sweetheart. Thomas Liet. The words tasting like bitter ash in his mouth. He looked down at his plate, unable to meet her innocent, hopeful gaze. I have to go to work really early tomorrow. The site is just too busy right now. Sarah's face fell, just a fraction of an inch. But she quickly masked it with the practiced, heartbreaking resilience of a child who is entirely used to disappointment. Oh, okay. Dad, I'll ask Mom. That night, lying awake in the suffocating dark of his bedroom, Thomas felt a profound sense of spiritual betrayal. He stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding with raw anxiety. He felt that God's purpose had been entirely misunderstood. I did everything you asked, he thought, his silent, internal prayer laced with heavy bitterness. I sacrificed my body. I sacrificed my precious time with my little girl. I played by the harsh rules of this world to keep them safe. Why are you letting me drown? He did not yet understand the profound hidden truth that God was not drowning him. God was mercifully, forcefully breaking the very chains that were dragging his soul under. The next morning, Thomas woke long before dawn, just as he had done for 10 years. He put on his heavy, mud-stained boots out of pure, terrifying habit. He filled his battered thermos with bitter coffee. He kissed his sleeping wife gently on the forehead, quietly walked past Sarah's room with a heavy heart, and drove away in the rain. But this time, he had absolutely no destination. For hours, he drove aimlessly through the sprawling, gray, industrial outskirts of the city, burning precious gasoline he could no longer afford. trapped entirely in the psychological prison of his own deception. The sheer weight of the lie was suffocating. Every mile he drove felt like another heavy brick added to a massive wall separating him from his family, from his authentic self, and from God. By mid-morning, the storm intensified. The rain came down in blinding, punishing sheets. Thomas's truck sputtered, and seeking refuge, he pulled into the empty, cracked asphalt parking lot of an old brick church on the edge of town. He put the truck in park and killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab was deafening, pressing against his eardrums. He reached for his heavy metal lunchbox on the passenger seat, packed lovingly by his wife just hours ago. Completely unaware of his ruin, and something inside him simply snapped. He threw open the heavy truck door and stepped out into the freezing deluge. He grabbed the metal lunchbox and hurled it with all his might into the mud. He walked toward the locked, heavy oak doors of the dark church, the freezing rain plastering his hair to his forehead, and he finally let out the sacred, primal anger he had been swallowing for years. "Where are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking against the rumble of thunder. "I gave them my hands, I gave them my back, I missed her birthdays, I missed my life. I did it all to provide. And they threw me away like garbage. Why did you abandon me when I did everything right?" He fell to his knees in the wet, sharp gravel, weeping openly, the hot tears mixing with the bitter, freezing rain. Like the psalmists of old, like Job in the ashes, his anger in the rain was not a rejection of faith, but a desperate, agonizing prayer for a God who listens. It was the primal cry of a soul that had built its entire foundation on the shifting sands of corporate value, only to watch it wash away. He desperately needed to be heard. He needed to know that his pain mattered to the creator of the universe. As his heavy breathing slowly steadied, he wiped his face and looked up. Just a few yards away, standing near the cracked sidewalk, was a weathered glass sign box belonging to the church. The white plastic letters were slightly crooked, illuminated by a single, flickering bulb against the deep gloom of the storm. It read Jeremiah 2:9-11, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future." Thomas stared at the glowing words. The sheer audacity of that ancient promise in the face of his absolute, immediate ruin felt almost insulting at first. Yet, as he knelt there in the mud, a strange, profound stillness began to settle over the parking lot. The chaotic, frantic ticking clock of his anxiety seemed to pause. The memory of a sermon he had heard years ago drifted into his mind, a sermon about Christ, the tecton. Jesus was not a man of wealth or corporate power. He was a builder, a man who worked with his hands, intimately familiar with the rough weight of raw materials and the sweat of honest, grueling labor. But Christ worked at a human pace. He possessed time for the outcasts, time for the children, time for the quiet moments of divine grace. Christ invited the weary to find rest, not to grind themselves into dust. Thomas looked down at his own calloused, trembling hands. He had reached the midpoint, the absolute point of no return. He could not keep lying. He could not go back to the hustle. He had to face his reality and trust that he was still valuable. But to survive the week, he needed cash to buy groceries. He remembered the incredibly expensive set of professional masonry and carpentry tools sitting in the heavy lockbox in the back of his truck. Tools he had bought with his own hard-earned money over the years. Tools he believed he no longer needed. He would take them to the local hardware exchange and sell them. It was a total surrender of his old life. He wiped his face, stood up from the mud, and got back into the truck. The local hardware exchange was a massive, drafty warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, smelling deeply of engine oil, fresh sawdust, and old iron. Thomas walked through the heavy sliding doors, carrying the heavy steel lockbox containing his tools. Every step felt like a slow march to his own funeral. Selling his tools was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was the relinquishing of his identity as a builder, as he stood waiting near the appraisal counter, looking out the large, open loading dock doors into the rainy alleyway. He noticed an old man. The man was perhaps in his late 70s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a canvas shop apron. Struggling deeply, he was trying to load several massive, rough-hewn planks of solid red oak into the back of an old, rusted pickup truck. The wood was soaked from the rain, making it impossibly heavy, and the old man's hands were shaking violently under the tremendous strain. Several younger, able-bodied contractors walked swiftly past the old man, their heads down, entirely consumed by their own tight schedules and ringing cell phones. This was the true, hidden cost of the modern hustle culture, a spiritual blindness that completely erased basic human charity in the name of efficiency. Thomas stood there, tightly gripping his heavy lockbox, his first instinct trained by years of brutal corporate survival, and his current state of despair was bitter self-preservation. I have no job. A dark, whispering voice echoed in his mind. I am a failure. I have my own family to save. I have absolutely no energy left to give away to a stranger for free. But the image of the old man struggling in the freezing rain perfectly mirrored his own terrifying breakdown in the church parking lot just an hour earlier. The confrontation happening within Thomas was not a loud shouting match. It was a profound, silent spiritual war between the coldness of a broken world and the warmth of divine grace. Thomas set his lockbox down heavily on the concrete floor. He walked out into the freezing rain, stepping up to the old man just as a massive oak plank began to slip dangerously from his weakened grip. I've got it, Thomas said quietly, his voice steady. He didn't wait for an answer or permission. He slid his calloused, grease-stained hands under the rough, vet wood. The sheer weight of the oak was magnificent. It was not the dead, sterile, unforgiving weight of corporate steel, but the living, breathing weight of creation. Thomas adjusted his stance, lifting with his strong legs, and guided the heavy plank smoothly and safely into the bed of the truck. Without a single word, he turned and helped the old man lift the remaining 4 planks, moving with a deep reverence and precision, born of a decade of hard labor. When they finally finished, they stood under the metal awning of the loading dock, catching their breath as the rain pounded the tin roof. The old man looked at Thomas, his sharp, intelligent blue eyes studying the younger man's mud-stained boots and the deep permanent callus on his hands. You know how to carry weight, the old man said, his voice raspy but incredibly warm. Most men just try to muscle it, try to force it. You respected the wood. I've carried a lot of things, Thomas replied, looking down at his trembling hands. But I don't have anything left to build. I just lost my job this morning. I'm selling my tools just to feed my family. The old man nodded slowly, wiping the rain from his weathered face with a clean rag. In the historical memory of the early church, the carpenter, the tekton, was not a man who rushed to build towering empires. He was a man who knew the sacred weight of honest labor, who built things to serve the community. I own a custom woodworking shop a few miles from here. I build large dining tables, church altars, things meant to gather people together and last for generations. My hands are getting too old to manage the heavy lifting and the daily operations. I've been praying for a manager who understands the hard work, but more importantly, a man who understands the dignity of the materials. Thomas looked up, stunned into absolute silence. The revelation hit him like a physical shockwave. We must be careful not to view grace as a simple transaction. Heaven does not pay an hourly wage. And God did not orchestrate a magical coincidence just because Thomas lifted a piece of wood. Rather, by choosing to step out of his bitter isolation, by choosing to forgive the world and perform an act of selfless charity, Thomas had finally opened his spiritual eyes to the providence that had been standing right in front of him all along. The hidden truth was suddenly blindingly clear if Thomas had stayed in the corporate hustle. Too busy, too exhausted, and too consumed by his own anxiety, he would have walked right past this old man. His job loss was not a divine abandonment. It was a forceful, loving rescue from a system that was destroying his soul and stealing his family. Thomas took the job. It was not a magical fairy tale resolution that solved every single financial problem instantly. The salary at the quiet woodshop was significantly less than what he made pouring concrete and erecting steel for the massive corporate plazas. There were no stock options, no massive quarterly bonuses to chase, and no shiny, impressive titles to hide behind. But there was peace, a deep, abiding, undeniable peace. The justice in Thomas's life was earned, morally symmetrical, and spiritually profound. True restoration did not look like Thomas triumphantly returning to the construction site to gloat over the young foreman who fired him. There is no grace or healing in cheap revenge. Instead, the divine vindication was entirely internal and relational. God had meticulously restored the exact things the hustle culture had stolen from him: his dignity, his precious time, and his voice as a father. The air in the old man's shop always smelled beautifully of cedar, linseed oil, and warm, golden dust. The work was physically demanding, requiring skill and strength, but it was paced by the natural rhythm of human hands, not the frantic ticking of an algorithmic clock. At 4:00 p.m. every single afternoon, Thomas washed the fragrant sawdust from his hands, locked the heavy wooden doors of the shop, and drove home while the sun was still high in the sky. While we cannot always trace the exact hand of God in our immediate suffering, later Christian memory preserves the profound truth that true provision is not merely financial, it is presence. Thomas finally understood that his family did not need a flawless, wealthy provider. They desperately needed a father who was awake to their lives. He needed to be guided, and God had provided the map. The toxic lie that he had to destroy himself to be worthy of love was permanently broken. He confessed the absolute truth of his firing to Maria that very night, terrified she would be angry, but found only her tears of immense relief that the crushing burden of his old job, the job that was killing her husband, was finally gone. Months later, the ultimate payoff of his painful journey was realized not in a soaring bank account, but in a quiet, warmly lit room in his own home. The heavy, mud-caked, steel-toed boots that had weighed him down for a decade were gone, replaced by a comfortable pair of worn, sawdust-covered leather shoes resting gently on the clean floorboards. The battered metal thermos, once a stark symbol of his bitter, exhausted survival, was nowhere to be seen. The late afternoon sunlight streamed beautifully through the living room window, casting a warm, amber glow across a magnificent, handcrafted solid oak dining table. A table Thomas had built himself, the wood sanded incredibly smooth by his own calloused hands. It was a table built for gathering, not for isolation. Sitting right next to him at that table was Sarah. She was no longer drawing her father as a blurry, distant shadow, hidden beneath a hard hat. Instead, she was laughing. A bright, clear, musical sound that filled the room, as Thomas patiently and joyfully helped her glue the final pieces of cardboard onto her history project. He was fully awake. He was fully present. He was home, and in the quiet, sacred space between a father's gentle, restored hands and a daughter's joyful smile. The true, eternal work of his soul was finally complete. The story of Thomas is a profound reflection on the modern idols of productivity and self-reliance. In today's relentless hustle culture, we are frequently conditioned to believe that our ultimate value lies entirely in our economic output. We wear our chronic exhaustion like a badge of honor, sometimes sacrificing the very people we are working so desperately to protect. Thomas's journey forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. Are we truly providing for our families, or are we simply hiding from them behind the heavy shield of our labor? From one perspective, his sudden job loss is a stark reminder of the coldness of systems that view human beings as expendable data. It is a genuine injustice that strips away human dignity. Yet, from a spiritual vantage point, it becomes a severe mercy. God often allows the painful removal of what we think we need in order to save us from what is quietly destroying our souls. By stripping away his corporate title and his overtime paycheck, Providence forced Thomas to rediscover the inherent, God-given dignity of his own hands and the irreplaceable value of his presence as a father. Furthermore, this narrative reclaims the historical memory of Christ as the tecton, the builder. Jesus did not come to build empires of endless, frantic profit. He worked with the grain of creation, valuing the soul of the laborer over the speed of production. When Thomas chose to help the old man in the rain, despite his own ruin, he broke the cycle of bitterness. It teaches us that grace is often found in the very moments we feel most depleted. Ultimately, true faith requires the spiritual courage to accept that God's plans might look like worldly failure, but are actually designed to lead us back home. If Thomas's journey resonated with your own struggles, or if you've ever found yourself searching for peace and meaning in the middle of a sudden storm, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their true worth today. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the powerful stories that shape our faith. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a painful, unexpected closed door in your life that later turned out to be a profound blessing in disguise? How did you find the spiritual courage to trust God's silent timing? Share your memories below, as your testimony might be exactly the light someone else needs to read today. And join us next time as we uncover the forgotten history of a quiet, hidden chapel that protected a priceless, sacred memory during one of history's most turbulent eras. You won't want to miss it.